We now have the last paper of this session by Lyla Brock from Canada, from the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. She's an archaeologist who has lived and worked in Egypt for many years, about 30 years, where she has specialized in epigraphic and restoration work with numerous foreign missions. But she has also focused on the Amarna period. Some of her projects have been to re-clear and conserve in KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings, and the material from the tomb of Anan, TT 120, in the Nobles area in the West Bank in Luxor. And she has copied reliefs, and she has worked in the tomb of Ramses VI and Merim Tah in the Valley of the Kings, and many other places. So today we will of course concentrate on the tomb of Tutankhamun and the remains of the south wall in the tomb. So welcome.
And here's the valley in the early 1920s, during the time the tomb of Tutankhamun was being excavated by Howard Carter, working for Lord Carnarvon. Today I want to talk about the south wall in the tomb. Here it is on Carter's tomb plan with the red arrow. This is the wall between the antechamber and the sepulchral burial chamber. Part of the wall was broken by Carter when the burial chamber was opened in 1923. What did the wall look like when the tomb was first decorated? What happened to the fragments of the wall? I will attempt to answer these questions during the next few minutes and present you with some new information that came to light as a result of the work of my husband, Ted Brock. I would also like to thank the Griffith Institute for providing relevant photographs. Most of this material has been published in Scribe magazine, the journal of the American Research Association in Egypt. But first, a little background. As we all know, the tomb of Tutankhamun was located on the west side of the Valley of the Kings, not very far from the entrance to the valley. It is close to the Amarna period tombs of Akhenaten, KV 55 that is, and Yuya and Tuya, KV 47. A number of tombs with very similar plans were apparently cut at the same time, but were not put into use until later, when they were probably underwent some alterations. You can see how the floor was lowered in KV 55. Probably the same thing happened in KV 62 to accommodate the sarcophagus and shrine. When these tombs were cut is unknown, but in the case of KV 55, according to my conservator, Adam Zelinsky, no relationship to Vladimir, I might add, who worked with me conserving KV 55, it was long enough for the cut rock to have shifted. One of the most important pieces of information I think that has come out recently about these tombs was by Steve Cross, who said KV 55, 62, 47, 35, and 63 are all related in some way. Parts of a glass vase were found in both KV 55 and KV 35. The same type of seals were found in KV 62 and KV 63. KV 63, 55, and 62 were, according to Cross, all buried at the same time by a debris-carrying flood. Cross wrote that the entrance to KV 62 was covered over with excavation material after it was closed. He estimated that it was 80 years between that event and the flood. The flood, he reasoned, was the reason all three tombs remained hidden for so long. Here is Steve Cross's photograph of the flood debris levels above KV 63. Otto Schotten, who was the excavator, estimated that there was 12 flood levels. But back to the last century. On the evening of the 16th of February, 1923, the scene in the antechamber of the newly found tomb of Tutankhamun was lit with electric lights like a movie set. Howard Carter's dramatic description of removing the partition wall between the antechamber and the sepulchral burial chamber was not entirely accurate, although the 20 officials and invited guests present would only learn that much later. Between Carter and Glory stood a partition wall separating the burial chamber from the antechamber. It had been constructed in 3 parts, and Carter would eventually remove it in 2 stages. Here is Carter's illustration of the blocking. The central part, stamped with the seals of the necropolis, was taken down that night. The rest was removed during the second season of work, when most of the finds in the burial chamber had been dealt with. On December the 1st, 1923, Carter wrote in his journal, "Commenced pulling down partition wall. The top part of the level of wooden lintel found to be hollow and comprised of dry stonework of splinters of limestone and flint boulders, plastered only on the outer portions of the partition wall on the inner side. The decorated portion of plaster on the inside face of the west door jamb was removed with fair success, sufficiently good to reconstruct the scene thereon for eventual record." This is Burton's photograph of the fragments of that part of the wall. This is the photo from the archives of the Griffith Institute taken by Harry Burton, showing the assembled fragments laid out in a sandbox, the edges of which are still visible in his photo. Burton was seconded to the expedition by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here he is with Howard Carter. Burton used KV 55 as his photography studio when shooting the finds from KV 62. I found bits of his blackout paper sticking to the wall and some chemical splashes. As far as I know, Burton's photo of the south wall only exists in black and white. However, he had been experimenting with color photography. Invented in 1907, as I found some of his color plates in KV 55. Here are these fragments and also a photo taken of Burton of the bracelet of Tutankhamun. But to return to 1923 and that dramatic evening in the tomb. In fact, Carter, Carnarvon, and Carnarvon's daughter, pardon me, Lady Evelyn, knew what was on the other side of the wall because they had already gone through. Here's the breach in the wall. A few months before, in the dark of night, Carter had dug out the plaster and stones from what he said was an old breach in the bottom of the wall, and the trio squeezed through. Dazzled by the glittering, gilded, and inlaid shrine towering over their heads, the paintings on the wall behind them would naturally have been ignored. Yet, if they had glanced over their shoulders, they would have seen something that would soon never again be viewed in its intact state. After they exited, Carter replastered the breach so that the antiquities inspector who arrived the next day would not notice it. When Alfred Lucas, who we just heard about, who was later helping with the finds, spotted the cover-up, Carter first claimed it was ancient work, then later admitted it was his own doing. Here's Carter's plan of the tomb, again, from the Griffith Institute. The closest Carter gets to describing the intact wall is a note on his plan of the tomb made in December 1923. The inner side within the burial chamber was painted and decorated like the rest of the chamber. And in volume 2 of his 3-volume series on the tomb of Tutankhamun, while describing the south wall, he wrote, "Depicted upon it are scenes of the king before certain divinities. At the west end, King Tutankhamun is figured between Anubis and Isis. He wears the hat headdress. The goddess Isis repeats here the same wishes as those of Nut upon the north wall, the words of which I have already given. Behind Anubis, the goddess Isis is again figured, and she holds in both hands symbols of water. She is accompanied by 3 great gods, lords of Duat. Thanks to George Johnson for this photograph. The figure of Isis painted on the plastered partition wall may have originally been painted on plastered rock, but perhaps the opening in the south wall was not wide enough to accommodate the shrine parts, so the masons cut back the antechamber wall. Still, it was not wide enough, so they were forced to cut out a further wedge-shaped piece, as Carter had explained in his journal on December the 2nd. Carter deduced from the splashes of water visible on the shrine's exterior that the plastering and painting of this wall, at least, was done after the shrine parts were inserted. But perhaps only the Isis figure was painted over the plastered cut. That may be why she looks so stylistically different from the other figures. On the south wall, the water signs on her hands differ from those on the north wall. You can also see that her feet are the same size as the others beside her, and the hands are the same size, but the height of the figure itself is much shorter on the right than it is on the left. Strangely, while the glyphs and feet of the figures on both walls are the same size, the south wall composition is smaller than that on the north wall. Its height from baseline to ceiling is approximately 193 centimeters versus 244 centimeters on the north wall. And it is presently 282 centimeters long. The bottom of its dado is level with the floor of the antechamber and lines up with the scene on the east wall, while the scene on the north wall lines up with that on the west. The yellow dado has been added to the bottom of the south and east walls, apparently to balance the whole composition. The scene on the south wall is based on a grid of 18 squares, a typical 18th dynasty proportions, whilst the north wall grid is 20, typical of the Amarna period. Both walls are the same length, that is about 638 centimeters. In 2009, Factum Arte made a colored replica based on Burton's photo as part of their project of producing a facsimile of KV-55. But still no news about the fate of the fragments of the wall until a dramatic moment in 1922. This is the tomb of Bai in the Valley of the Kings. Go back here. See at the bottom. One day, Ted Brock and myself were strolling down the central pathway from the tomb of Merneptah, where we had been recording his finds, and past the tomb of Bai, KV-13. Ted stopped and pointed through the door grill to the back of the tomb and asked me, "Do you know what that is?" I could see a rubber basket on the ground. "There," he said. "In that basket are the fragments of the doorway taken down in the tomb of Tutankhamun." I was astounded. Like everyone else, I thought they had completely disappeared. "You should photograph them," I suggested. "Nobody knows they still exist." Ted was a very good photographer. Here he is photographing the canopic jars from KV-55 in the Cairo Museum. Thank goodness he took my advice, which he didn't always do, and in due course, we got permission. Accompanied by an inspector who opened the gate, we took the basket and its contents a short distance away to be photographed. We laid the fragments out individually on a black cloth and added number tags and scales. Ted and I counted 123 fragments. They were not in very good condition. A lot of the paint layered on the surface was spalled, but we could identify black, white, blue, red ochre, and green on a yellow ochre ground. Only a percentage could be identified as to subject matter and keyed to parts of the original painting. This was the back of Isis' head. This was her collar. And one of the water signs on her hands. The heads of the two gods were easily recognized, and the back and feet of the lowest. It seems the hair of the gods was painted blue, their skin was brown, and their beards black. Their bodies were outlined in red. When Ted had finished his photography, the rubber basket containing all the pieces was returned to its storage in the tomb of Bai. After that, the fragments seem to have disappeared. That is the bottom of the lowest god. The tomb of Bai was flooded during the infamous Theban flood of 1994. Here's my plan showing the path of the floodwaters that I witnessed at the time. The plaster fragments might have been washed away. When Ted died in 2005, I inherited all his research material, including his photo archive. That included the photos of the plaster fragments, apparently now the only record of their existence. What can we learn from this discovery? For one thing, we have real evidence for the colors. According to Factum Arti, the three gods on the left, the colors of the three gods on the left were unknown. As it was impossible to confidently attribute color, they have been left in monochrome. That's what Factum Arti said. The fragments show the whole south wall was painted ochre before the figures were added. There is enough detail left for me to locate some fragments on Burton's photograph. I did this by zooming in and arranging the fragments on the image by subject matter or by matching the outlines of the cracks. Some of the pieces, like the part of the figure of the lowest god on the left and Isis' headdress, were quite large, while others were minuscule. With the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun looming, it seemed a good time for me to take another look at our fragments and the remains of the wall and see what else could be done with them. This is what the tomb looks like today. One of Burton's photos, number P1592 in the Griffith, shows more of the glyphs remaining behind Anubis than is now visible. And by combining those glyphs with what is left in front of Isis, it was possible to reconstruct the original text. Carter did give us a clue that it was the same speech on the opposite wall. I thank Rob Desmarais for his help with the following inscription. I fit the Burton photo of Isis to his photo on the south wall by lining up the register line and the remains of an N glyph. Gardner sign glyphs N35. In front of Isis with a similar group of glyphs on the opposite wall. And here's my reconstruction. Isis is addressing Tutankhamun. The restored text now reads, "She, Isis, will give health and life to your nose forever and ever." Since there seems to be room for the second small vertical stroke at the bottom, the suggested reading would then be Shipson, twice or double, the missing sign being Gardner 050. This new restoration establishes the width of the painting with the figure included as 382.5 centimeters. And what about the rest of the wall? The scene as we have it is bracketed by the acrid sign at the top, so we know that it is probably all there was to it as far as the figures are concerned. When I was in the tomb recently, I noticed that the yellow paint extended about 1 meter beyond the cut in the wall. Roughly the extent of the painting is reconstructed here. And I did a reconstruction, putting the picture back on the wall. You can see that perhaps that wall in the tomb of Tutankhamun was wider than it is now, and it was the wall was widened in order to accommodate the shrine, the sarcophagus. Although Howard Carter has been criticized on many fronts, it is due to his diligence in saving these small fragments that we have a glimpse of the south wall today. Unfortunately, none of them gives us a glimpse of what was behind the three gods. This remains open to conjecture, but as the recovery of these pieces show, it is always possible some further evidence will show up. Thank you very much for your attention.